So this recital is the first, I'm hoping, of many that is going to explore the concept of religion in music. And several of you I know from church here at University Presbyterian Church, and this is something that we engage with on a weekly basis. We get to worship God through music, usually through hymnody, or listening to music during the offering, or as a prelude, or as a moment of prayer or meditation. And that has been a part of certainly the classical music canon for centuries. Music has been a way to worship God. But what's interesting is that every country, every era, every genre and style of music has found different ways of engaging with this. And I started to ask the question, as philosophers do, we ask lots of questions. What is it that actually makes music religious? Is it the composer's intent? Is it the lyrics? Is it the heart of the performer? Is it the heart of the listener? What is it that actually transforms music from just being something you listen to this religious experience, something that allows you to commune with God? And I had a book called Religious Meditations for Violin and Piano. It's a pretty good start, right? I had this book, and I've played out of it for years. I've played it as prelude and offertory at my previous church, and loved the pieces, and a striking number of them, about 70% of the book, were these French Romantic composers, French composers from the 19th century. And I thought, that's fine, because I love French music, I love French Romanticism, and so I didn't put much thought into it until I had the opportunity to meet Alexandra and start asking these bigger questions and organize this recital. So today, we're specifically looking at French composers from the 19th century and starting to dig into some of the context of the music. For those of you that have been to some of my orchestra concerts at Seattle Pacific University, or if you had the fortune to hear my wife and I perform here in the fall, you'll know that I want you to be an active part of this recital. So the seats are pretty close, and believe it or not, I'll probably get up into your face, so even if you're in the back row, you're not hiding. Right? I'm going to come up, and I want you to be a part of this conversation, because as listeners, you are a very important part, and something I consider sort of a sacred part of this musical experience. There's three people that are vital to a musical experience. There's the composer, the performer, and the listener. If there isn't someone here to listen to the music that we're making, the whole process, the aesthetic process, is lost. So you are part of this experience. We're bringing the notes of these composers to life as performers, but as you listen to it, I want to challenge you to ask some of the same questions we have is, what makes music religious? And I'm going to share some of the context of these works as we go through the recital. Alexandra, I feel I'm a talker, as you already know. She's known me for a few of them, but is there anything else that you wanted to add, or anything else to talk about?
Well, maybe I wrote my dissertation about pre-Romantic aesthetics. And the interesting thing regarding some of these authors is that at the end of the Enlightenment, religion lost its meaning. People were looking for something else, to heal them, to heal the world, to have some meaning in life, and they came up with arts and music, especially music. So music somehow replaced religion at the end of the 18th century. And I always thought it's interesting why that was possible. It was possible because of emotions. Because religion speaks to emotions, and music and the arts in general speak to emotions. And that was one reason why Romantic authors in their writings, especially German authors and Austrian authors, try to put forward music as a substitute or supplement to religion. And it's always interesting to see, can music do that? What does music to me? And is aesthetic experience really so close to religious experience, or are there differences? And we're interested in learning from you what we do with you, or what happens in you, in your soul when we play this music.
Fantastic. So there's no printed program. This is relatively informal. We'll introduce each of these. The first is by Georges Bizet, very famous French composer, most well known for his operas, particularly Carmen, of several suites that he's performed for or written for orchestra. And so this comes from a suite that was originally a part of a small play, incidental music for a play, but it was ascribed with the text to the Agnus Dei, so the regular part of a mass. Bizet himself was Catholic, identified as Catholic, and this became a part of a mass, a piece that could be performed as the Agnus Dei, the Lamb of God. And so we're going to perform this first work for you, and again, just invite you, be active listeners, be critical of what it is you're hearing. Do you believe that it is religious in any way? So see, now you have to be a part of this. Is that religious music? What do you think? What did you hear?
When you said that Unused Day was ascribed to it, was it the title that it was given, or was it?
No, it was the text. It was
So then you had
performed.
text.
Yeah, it was performed as a proper part of the Mass, as an Agnus Dei and a Catholic Mass.
It seemed like the pianist was, the chorus, very commanding.
Yeah.
And like you were like answering, like being drawn in or something like that, or is that kind of weird? Or?
Not at all. Not at all. Here's the part that I saved this because this is the interesting part. Bizet himself actually did not set this as an Agnus Dei. This was published posthumously. After he died, one of his friends took it because it was so popular, he realized he could make money selling it to a publisher, and the words of the Agnus Dei fit perfectly with this. And it was such a popular melody, they thought, hey, we could publish this and market this as this really great piece to put into the Mass. And they made a lot of money on it. This was after Bizet died. He never actually intended for it. In fact, it was from this incidental music for Alexandra, which was this really great play. It was set in Provence in France, and it was all about sort of young lovers, and someone gets cheated on and they commit suicide, like most of the things that happen in French romantic literature. So there's this really, not debaucherous, but sort of this kind of crazy story, love-tangled story that this music was written for. But then after Bizet died, someone came along and said, hey, this would be really good music since it's so popular to put in church, because everybody's going to know this melody, and then we can introduce this religious text and get them to be drawn in. Believe it or not, this is something that Bach was actually famous for in the Lutheran Church in general. I know most of us are Presbyterians, so it's okay, we can talk about the Lutherans. So the Lutheran Church was infamous for this. They would take drinking songs and they would take songs from the bar and change the lyrics and invite people in. So as you were kind of stumbling home on Saturday, you would say, I know that song, and you'd walk in the door and Bach's improvising on this great prelude, and they would get you into the church. Some of you that have seen Sister Act, this is another one of those places it was used. Great movie. And they kind of used the music to entice you in. So this is a challenge. The composer actually never intended for this to be religious at all, yet it was published in a book called Religious Meditations for Violin and Piano, and it was performed as a regular part of a Catholic Mass. It had nothing to do with that. So I'm glad nobody volunteered immediately. Like, there's a great religious piece. Well, is it really religious? Maybe you had that experience. Do I get to take that away from you just because of the context? It's the challenge. I've got some furrowed brows. This excites me.
Define religious and what religion, and to me, so that religions, Christian religion is
Yeah.
the one that truly has the supreme being, our Creator.
Yeah.
And the other, like Hinduism and Buddhism, really are kind of faded to woodwork type of religions. But this has that supreme part, plus it has the heart. So I see more of a Christian religion in this than maybe some other religions.
That's fantastic. I love that. I hadn't thought about it. To consider it in context of other faiths. I love that. Well, should we hear some more music?
Yes.
Let's transition to a new composer. How about Massenet? You probably know him, another great French composer, wrote some great operas, famous for Thais, beautiful opera, and we'll actually hear from that later. This is a piece entitled The Last Dream of the Virgin, and it is taken, and now, well, full disclosure, there's no tricks in this one, so there's no tricks. This was actually written as a part of an oratorio, a sacred work for orchestra, solo voices, and chorus to honor the sort of the life of the Virgin Mary. And this is taken from the second act. It's called The Last Dream of the Virgin. This is supposed to be when the Virgin Mary was visited by Gabriel to be told that you were going to give birth to the Messiah. And so this is this very beautiful melody, one of his best-known melodies that was written specifically for this scene in the oratorio. And Liszt actually did a great piano version of this. So it was popular in its time and has kind of faded into obscurity over the centuries, but it's interesting. So this has a lot of religious context. Massenet himself was a devout Catholic. And so The Last Dream of the Virgin, originally written for violin with accompaniment. So this is kind of in its original form. It's not a song, it's meant to be instrumental. So we hope you enjoy this next selection. Is religious music?
It sounded like a lullaby.
Yeah. I absolutely agree. Other thoughts?
That's exactly what I thought. I thought like, hey grandma, your mom was passed away, Joe didn't go to the spirit, and he wants to love the girl who's not with me. What do you do with this?
Yeah.
You love it, you know?
Is the composer's intent affecting the way you listen to it? I mean, does anybody feel comfortable offering, do you imagine a scene of Mary being visited, this last dream she has before she assumes this responsibility of giving birth to Christ? As a performer, it's something that I struggle with as I'm trying to listen to it and hearing some of these sort of extra musical things. There's fortes and pianos and dynamic changes and different pitches, and what is the story that's meant to be told? Because it's not articulated by Massenet. He doesn't say, this is the moment the angel shows up and then Mary opens her eyes, or they don't give us any directions like that. So I have to sort of conjure my own story of what are these pitches? What is it supposed to represent? Is it lulling her to sleep? Is it just seeing her asleep? Is it supposed to be literal? Or is it incidental music like Bizet wrote? Just something that happens in the background, a way to set a scene. Anybody have a thought on that?
Yeah, I was thinking about how what Mary was probably thinking of or dwelling on before this huge change in her life that came when the angel visited her. And then she was probably thinking about her upcoming marriage.
Yeah.
And she was most likely quite young, and so she could have just been having the daydreams of a young girl and thinking about what is my life going to be like when I'm married to Joseph, and that's the only thing that she had. So it was quite peaceful and serene, and okay, I've kind of checked off this big step in my life that's about to happen, but she doesn't. It's like the calm before this. God throws a huge plot twist at her, and the music would most likely change after that.
Yeah, the oratorio, if you haven't listened to it, it's called La Vierge, the Virgin. It's extraordinary. It's got just wild swings of emotion and character and plots that are in it. It's an amazing work, and this is just a little snippet of it. And it's difficult too, because you're hearing a part of a much larger work. So the context of all of that is not necessarily here. You're not hearing this after the prophecy and everything else that's happened in her life. Good, I like this. I see furrowed brows, and that's always a good sign. How about some more music? Let's stay with Massenet and go to something that a lot of you are probably familiar with. So this is the Meditation from Thais. Thais is an opera that Massenet wrote. It is religious with sort of a question mark and an exclamation point. So Thais is I'm trying to find this sort of PC way of saying it. She is a courtesan in the Roman-ruled Egypt, and she belongs to a very wealthy Roman citizen. And a monk has been having these dreams about her in the monastery, and tells the person in charge of the monastery, I think I need to go to Egypt and I need to try to rescue this woman. God has given me visions of her. So he goes to Egypt. Long story short, he tries to convert her, and in trying to convert her, he falls in love with her. Well, at the end of the second act, there's this amazing scene, and this again is written as the original. This is written as a violin solo, and Thais is left alone after what the monk assumes is a failed conversion, but ends up working because she goes into a very deep prayer that lasts all night. She goes into a meditation in which she repents for her sins and asks for God's forgiveness and decides that this life of sinly flesh that she has lived for so long is not what she's meant to do, and she's going to leave her post, just leave her entire life, and she's going to become a nun. And so she goes through this whole night of prayer, and that's what we're hearing is this meditation that Thais goes through. And then in the next act, she wakes up, and she goes with the monk, and they leave, and she starts her life in the monastery. Well, again, like all great French romantic works, the monk is devastated because he realized in the conversion he's fallen madly in love with her, and even though he drops her off to become a nun, which must have been a very interesting, right? Okay, good job, go be a nun now. He goes back to his monastery and starts having these fascination, just completely infatuated with her. He has all these fantasies about her, and he renounces all of his orders. He completely gives up his life and God and says, none of this matters, only my love for Thais matters. And when he goes to find her, she's on her deathbed, because I guess the conversion did that to her, I don't know what it was. So she's on her deathbed, and at her deathbed he says, nothing else matters but my love for you. There is no God, nothing else matters. And in her dying breath, she describes the heavens opening up and God accepting her as forgiven. And so you're left, towards the end of the Enlightenment, with this incredible conflict of, is there a God? Is he what is important? Was she really saved? What was the purpose of this monk? Now that he's given up God, is he going to end up in heaven? And Massenet really challenges us in this opera that is religious, because it creates all this conflict. But it is set to some of the most beautiful music, French opera music that was ever written. And this piece has become sort of a standalone work for violin. But I think the context is really important. This is a prayer of forgiveness and repentance from Thais after she's visited by this monk and challenged to be converted. So here's the meditation from Thais. I'm going to be totally biased. That's religious music, right? I mean, that's powerful. What were some of your thoughts? What did you hear?
So it just flowed from the heart, both love and in fact maybe a bit of torment in there too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it seemed like that serene melody was God speaking to her, and that torment was her not being sure she was worthy of his love.
As Alexandra said, I can't imagine the task. I mean, I'm a composer myself, but that challenge that existed of trying to use music to convey that kind of emotion, that kind of love and that pathos, and how to make that connection, particularly in light of everything that happened in the Enlightenment, of losing faith, as it were, or transitioning faith is probably a better word, because there was faith. There was faith in love and in life and in science and experiments, and it's interesting to hear someone like Massenet that's living through this and hearing all these things and a part of that culture, and to write something that has arguably stood the test of time, has become such a pivotal work in the idea of what can be accomplished with music. I love it. Alexandra confided in me. I asked her if she was a fan of Monty Python. She said that her husband is. And this is the moment in the Monty Python show where you would say, and now for something completely different. So a big transition to very famous opera by none other than Charles Gounod, another great French romantic composer. And this is from Faust. How many of you have heard of the opera Faust? Okay, fantastic. If you're not familiar with it, the one thing you need to know before we start this is that a very elderly scholar, someone that is sort of a genius in his own right, has spent his entire life dedicated to learning, in his dying breath decides that all of this work has been for nothing. He hasn't enjoyed his life, and he spent all this time trying to learn about the meaning of life and what it all means, and he feels like he's wasted it, and he makes a deal with the devil, literally. Mephistopheles shows up and makes a deal with him and gives him this elixir of youth, and he basically has to live his life all over again and travel the world having any of the women that he wants, all the money that he wants, anything that the devil can give to him is his, as long as he has traded his soul, which he has done. As you can imagine, it does not end well for Faust. But this is at the end of Act 2. There's a great scene in which his love interest is exposed, and you kind of recognize that she is this pure soul that he is trying to corrupt with his sort of desires for her. And there's a moment at which the devil decides to distract everybody in this small village that they're in with this dance. So they go into this kind of fun party and dance this really big waltz at the end of Act 2 in Faust. And so this is a little excerpt of that, this waltz. And sort of to what you said, I'm curious if this music is religious, considering it's the devil trying to distract you, and what kind of religious experience does that offer? So I wanted to offer this piece for your consideration. Here is the waltz.
But it's fine if you start moving,
Yes.
So that's completely fine.
It doesn't mean you've succumbed to the devil
No,
either. It's
no,
okay.
so
You feel like you need to
but
waltz.
You can also, we hope we play it this way.
be distracted if that broke out in the middle of my day, I think.
You know, the devil can't corrupt beauty. And if you go to it with a heart of gratitude and joy, very grateful to the Lord, the devil can't corrupt that.
Amen.
You know,
Yeah.
God can just make it fun and beautiful.
Yeah.
The devil's always trying to get somebody around for their money for their soul, like that song with the one down George for his soul, Still Johnny.
Oh, yeah.
They played him, won the fiddle. I should give Johnny a run for his money.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Let's consider Gounod a little more. So, again, another devout Catholic composer, and actually wrote a mass for Saint Cecilia, who's considered the patron saint of music and the arts, and wrote a hymn for Saint Cecilia that was interestingly enough, was never meant to be sung. So we think of hymns as a song to worship God, and he wrote this originally just as a melody, and has had several different iterations, and this one specifically is for violin and piano, but sort of beautiful. And I think this challenges religion a little bit, because this is a hymn specifically to a saint, and a lot of the music that we consider religious is usually to a rather large religious figure. Depending on the religious context, in a Christian setting, right, it might be to the glory of Jesus or the glory of God or to Mary. And so here is a hymn specifically to Saint Cecilia, which actually categorizes this as something that is predominantly Catholic. But what does that mean to have that same sort of religious adoration in that context? Again, this is from the same composer we just heard from Charles Gounod, and this is not taken from a larger work as the other pieces are. This is sort of a standalone piece that he wrote, a hymn to Saint Cecilia. sing that hymn on Sunday? Thoughts? You stunned them to silence. Pretty good. Is that religious music? Is it just pretty music?
To me, it felt the most religious.
Really?
Of all of them.
Oh, wow. That's fantastic.
Yeah. But I had the sense that it's always going up.
Yes.
Yeah, the resolution of the notes was always kind of, it wasn't darkness settling, it was always a lifting sort of feeling.
Yeah, that's a fantastic observation. That piece I have to tickle my nose quite a bit. I mean, it forces me to be in the upper part of the instrument, which is, you know, Gounod, he knew what he was doing to write in the higher register. It definitely does translate something. I mean, it communicates
You can't
something.
stay there, right? It was always moving.
Yeah,
It's always moving.
yeah, absolutely.
One thing is, often when it's in the higher register for violin, it can start to feel a little bit harsh, but this always felt very soft, despite.
I think he does a great way of writing for piano too. That it's always very supportive. I mean, it's very collaborative in this one. That you kind of hear how it supports what's happening. So it doesn't sound like a screeching violin. Hopefully it doesn't. That it's always supported harmonically underneath too. Well, we have two more works for you, and I'm very grateful to Alexandra for sort of challenging me. I sent her a list of these original works, and she said, "This is fantastic. There's a lot of old dead white Frenchmen on the program." And I said, "Oh my goodness!" She said, "Can we, program for a female composer?" And I thought, "This is fantastic," and I could not agree with her more. And I stumbled across a composer I did not know a lot about, and I had never performed before, and that was Lili Boulanger, who was the sister to the famous Boulanger, who was the composition teacher. For those of you that stay close to sort of the classical world and what was happening at the time, Bernstein, a lot of famous composers and musicians studied with her sister, but Lili was younger, had sort of a tragically short life, only was writing and publishing for less than about 8 years. And I looked into her canon of works. It's very small, but I noticed one of the very first pieces that she published, one of the first pieces that she wrote, and one of the last pieces that she wrote in her very short life. She got sick and died quite suddenly. Were both written for violin and piano, which I thought was very fitting, considering that's who was going to be performing today. And so we want to play the Nocturne. It was published in 1911. Again, one of the very first works that she had written. She'd been writing for a while, actually, but this is one of the first things that she sort of published to represent herself as a composer. And then what is called Du matin de printemps, so this spring morning in springtime. Sort of the first and I think you'll hear a pretty stark contrast in terms of style, even though these are only about 7 years apart. The second piece was published in 1918. So in a relatively short career as a composer that's publishing her works, you'll hear a lot of influences of very famous French composers, but also things that I think share her voice. I think she writes in a very unique way. Did you want to add anything to Lili? I'm just grateful that you challenged me to find this music, because I think it's fantastic. If you are not familiar with Lili Boulanger, I hope that you go to Spotify and your playlists, wherever they are, and start adding her, because it's really fantastic music. And I should add that one of the reasons we could program her, she was a devout Catholic. When she was getting ready to pass away, she was actually working on a large mass. And it's supposed that the Du matin de printemps was going to be a part of that mass. I think it's just speculated, but a lot of the works that she wrote, she had a religious context, and she was a devout practicing Catholic. So these works in particular don't have religious titles or context, but the composer lived a life sort of piety and faith. And so we'll finish off with these last two works. page turns.
Yes. So it's maybe more difficult to turn the pages than to play the piece.
So I would love to know, before you go, is this religious music? Yeah?
God, I need to have a conversation with you about something.
Oh yeah.
I need to talk with you. That's what it feels like.
Yeah.
I think that as the listener, you can have a religious experience with any piece of music because God can work in your heart when you're listening. As a musician, as a trained musician, I want to know the context of the pieces, and that sometimes can get in the way of something like that being able to occur, because maybe I'm like, but this isn't religious music, so I can't necessarily like cram that on top of it. But there are other times in which the opposite can occur, and I can say, I realize it wasn't written in that context, but to me, it makes me think of God. And so it's all, it feels very subjective. I think you could decide for what one could decide for oneself. So this is a religious piece because it is for you.
Absolutely. I think as a young and aspiring scholar, especially in the same room with an incredible scholar and philosopher, Alexandra is an incredible author and actually just contributed to a book. It is, I want to get the title right, the chapter that you just did.
It was about
Religion,
the devil.
Music, and Education. Is that the title
Yes,
of the book?
it
right?
was about music education and religion, and I used the devil and the way the dialectical, like we heard in this waltz about Faust, the dialectics of the devil being very convincing, very nice, and always saying, well, you know, the bad is not bad, it's just the stuff which is not good yet, or, you know, like playing around with ideas and playing around with words. And I think that is very interesting. That is the core of Goethe's Faust. Because you cannot recognize the devil, because he's nice, he's good. He uses the good, you know, to hide that. That is something which in music education we also have to reflect concerning good intentions, which can turn into the other direction.
Yeah, I think the goal, it's a fantastic chapter, very interesting book that I just purchased. I saw that it came out. I'm really interested in this idea, especially teaching at a Christian university. But I bring it up because I think the goal for both of us as educators is to get people to have questions and to be critical and not necessarily just accept things. And I'm glad you articulated this. The really powerful thing is that you get to decide. You get to decide. If you get in your car and you're jamming out to like Creed or like 90s awesome pop Christian rock, and that is your religious experience, no one can take that away from you. If you listen to Lili Boulanger and it puts you in a state of prayer and meditation, like that's awesome. Maybe it's Metallica. Maybe it's like, you get to decide what your relationship is with God. And the power of the composer versus the performer versus the listener, I think is really beautiful. And I hope in presenting some of this music to you with the context that you can start asking some questions and be a critical listener. And several of you are musicians in the audience, that you can start looking at this music and deciding for yourself how it relates to you and your faith and religion in general. If that happened, although I think this was a great success in being able to collaborate with a fellow artist and do that, I think really if you've asked some important questions today and started considering how powerful music is as a tool to tap into things beyond our own understanding, to tap into something that can only be expressed through music, I think the recital worked. I think we did exactly what we needed to do. So thank you so much for spending an afternoon with us and joining us for this musical journey. Please feel free to stick around and we'll nudge some elbows. I don't know if we should be shaking lots of hands, but we'll nudge some elbows and use the hand sanitizer that's in the hallway. But again, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Alexandra, so much. Let's see if this actually did what it was going to do.